My name is Harold Wilkerson. I am 82 years old, and I live alone in a modest house on the outskirts of Belleville, Indiana, the house my wife Emma and I once called our nest, our starting point, and the place where, over the decades, we built a life thick with routines, habits, rituals, and quiet, stubborn love. The walls still hold the warmth of her perfume, faint lilac and clove, the sharpness of the cologne I stopped wearing when she passed, and the lingering trace of cinnamon apples she used to bake on Sundays. These smells greet me every morning like a memory too stubborn to leave. The house hasn't changed much since she died. I've kept it as it was, not out of sentimentality, but because altering anything would feel like a betrayal of her presence, which remains more vivid to me than most of the people I encounter these days. The rooms, once filled with laughter, footfalls, clinking glasses, and long contented silences, have become mausoleums of soundlessness. I still hear echoes of our conversations. Her voice, firm but kind, bouncing from the pantry door, or her humming from the upstairs bathroom when she was getting ready for church. These days, the only real sound is the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hall and the low whistle of the old furnace kicking in when the Indiana cold settles in early. It has been 6 years since Emma died. 6 long, slow years that have passed in a way I can only describe as a gentle decay. She died from cancer, stage 4 by the time they found it. What followed was a carousel of hospital rooms, generic art on beige walls, nurses who smiled too quickly, and endless nights of unspeakable pain managed with morphine and silence. She deteriorated like the seasons slipping into winter, at first subtle, almost unnoticeable, then suddenly brutal and final. I held her hand through it all, and near the end, in one of her last lucid moments, she looked at me, not with fear, but with a tired kind of knowing, and said, "If I go first, don't open the box. Not yet. Only when it feels right. Only when you feel ready to see what I saw." I nodded at the time, not sure what box she meant, thinking maybe it was her way of coping, a metaphor or a final act of theater. But after the funeral, as I was going through the bedroom closet, I found it, a plain box wrapped in an old baby blanket from when our daughter was born, tied with a faded blue ribbon. I placed it on the top shelf and didn't touch it again. I wasn't ready. I didn't want to be. Emma and I had one daughter, Marnie. She was our sun once, bright, brilliant, sharp in ways that made people pause. She had her mother's bone structure and my stubbornness, a combination that made her impossible to argue with and impossible not to admire. She was ambitious from the beginning, president of every student council, honors graduate, then off to college in Boston, then law school in Chicago. She called at first every Sunday. She visited during the holidays. Then the calls became sporadic. The visits stopped. There were always explanations. "Dad, I'm just slammed at work," or "It's just not a good time right now." I stopped asking. When Emma got sick, I called her. She came, but she came late. She stayed for maybe an hour, sitting stiffly by Emma's hospital bed, eyes darting around the sterile room, visibly uncomfortable. The next day she said, "I can't keep doing this. That's not Mom anymore. That's someone else." And then she left. Emma asked where she was later that night. I lied. I told her Marnie had gone home to rest, that she'd be back. Emma didn't say anything, just turned her face to the window and closed her eyes. I think she knew. She always knew more than she said. After the funeral, Marnie came by the house for maybe half an hour. She was wearing a tailored gray suit, the kind of thing people wear when they want to look dignified but untouched by grief. She gave me a polite hug, cold hands barely pressing against my back, and said, "Dad, have you thought about selling the house? It's big, and you're here alone. It's not efficient." Efficient. That's what she called it. I didn't answer. That night I sat in her old room, the one with the pink wallpaper and the unicorn bed sheets we never took down, and I drank 3 fingers of scotch until I could no longer remember how to say her name without trembling. Years passed like water down a drain. Marnie sent a card every Christmas, the kind with a printed message and no signature. Sometimes I called her, sometimes she answered. More often, I got voicemail. The message never changed. "Hi, it's Marnie. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." She never did. I learned to stop expecting her voice. I learned to live with the hollow sound of nothing. My days became patterns. Wake up, make coffee the way Emma liked it, 3 tablespoons of grounds, pinch of salt, 200 milliliters of water, pour over style. Her way. The coffee always turned out bitter. Not because the recipe was wrong, but because she made it with care, and I made it out of habit. The house aged with me. The kitchen faucet dripped no matter how tightly I turned it off. The stairs groaned under my weight. The hallway bulbs flickered even after I replaced them. Once a month, a boy from a community outreach program would stop by, help me carry groceries, fix a light switch, clear snow from the front walk. I tipped him more than I should have. He smiled politely, but I saw the look in his eyes. Pity. Nothing cuts deeper than the pity of someone who assumes your usefulness has expired. I rarely went out. The grocery store, the pharmacy, maybe the post office when I felt capable. Sometimes, in the summer, I sat on the back porch in Emma's old chair, watching birds land on the fence. They always came in pairs. I was always alone. I thought more often than I'd admit about what would happen if I died in my sleep, how long it would take for someone to notice. A week? 2? Maybe when the mailman noticed the pileup. It scared me. Not the dying, but the possibility of disappearing without anyone even caring. On those days, I would open the closet, take down the box, and sit with it on my lap. I never opened it. I just held it the way you might hold a letter you're too afraid to read. I told myself I wasn't ready. The truth was, I didn't want to know what was inside, because once I knew, I couldn't pretend anymore. Once I read whatever Emma had written, I'd have to face whatever she had left unsaid in life, and I was afraid it might be something that would shatter the only things I still believed were intact. Her love, my role in her life, our marriage. Some truths come late, and arrive not as closure, but as detonations. Then, one morning in April, Marnie came back. She didn't call ahead. She just knocked, 3 sharp raps like a stranger. She looked exactly as I remembered. Polished, pressed, professional. She was holding a pecan pie from a bakery, one of those store-bought attempts at nostalgia. I opened the door, unsure whether to hug her or ask her why. I told her she looked thinner. She replied, "No time to eat." We sat in the kitchen. I made tea. She looked around like she was seeing it all for the first time. The framed photos, the chipped tiles, the fading wallpaper Emma had chosen in 1978. Then she said it. "Dad, have you considered a retirement community? Somewhere with staff, with other people. You shouldn't be alone like this." I asked if I wasn't a person anymore. She didn't answer. As she got up to leave, she touched my shoulder, lightly, as if afraid of catching whatever loneliness I carried. And she said, "Forget the past. Forget Mom. It's time for closure." I stared at her, unable to process the coldness, the command in her voice, the erasure implied in her words. And when she walked out the door, when her car pulled away without a wave, I turned to the hallway closet, opened it, took down the box, and untied the ribbon. My hands were shaking. I knew, as sure as I'd ever known anything, that nothing after that moment would ever be the same. The first thing I noticed when I untied the ribbon was how carefully she had arranged everything inside, each envelope stacked by date, tied in sets with slim blue thread, her handwriting on the topmost letter as familiar to me as my own thoughts. I remember the way Emma used to write birthday cards for everyone in the family, her lettering tidy and slow, as if each word deserved its own moment to breathe. But this was different. This wasn't festive or sentimental. It felt deliberate, organized with the kind of intention that only comes when someone knows their time is running out. My hands trembled as I lifted the first bundle. The paper smelled faintly of lavender in the drawer where she had likely hidden them for years, waiting for me to become the man who could read them. I was not that man yet, but I was too far gone to stop. The first letter wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a love note. It was an observation, almost like a diary entry she didn't trust to leave to chance. "Harold," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer next to you, and that ache you carry in your chest, that endless space where my voice used to live, is probably still as heavy as the morning I left." She wrote about the hospital in unemotional tones, listing dates, visits, conversations with doctors, as if building a case. She noted how often I wasn't allowed into certain consultations, how Marnie had asked the nursing staff to speak only with her, citing legal guardianship, even though Emma had never signed such a paper. I didn't understand. I remembered those days, the tension, the hushed conversations, but I'd always assumed they were meant to protect Emma's dignity. Now, it seemed, they were walls. Walls I was shut out of. Walls Marnie built brick by careful brick. In a second letter, written a week later, Emma's tone shifted. It was colder. She wrote, "There were days I thought you didn't want to know what was happening to me, and that hurt more than the pain in my bones. But now I realize it wasn't you. It was her. Her, our daughter. She said Marnie kept telling her it was better if I didn't see her in certain states, that I needed to remember her as she was. And Emma, so tired, so confused by the drugs and the endless turning of days into nights, had accepted it, until she began to notice that I stopped coming altogether. Until she realized that I had been told she was sleeping or sedated when in fact she'd been sitting there, waiting." Emma wrote, "I saw it in your eyes when you did come. The confusion, the guilt. And I couldn't speak because I was afraid that if I called it what it was, you would see her differently. And maybe I still wanted you to protect her, even from herself." I stopped reading for a while. I sat in the kitchen with the box in front of me, the overhead light humming like an insect. The house felt colder than usual. The letters hadn't just reopened old wounds. They had pointed out that the wounds were never mine to begin with. I was a bystander in my wife's final battle, one she fought not only with her body, but with the quiet, suffocating betrayal of our only child. And yet, a part of me still resisted that conclusion. Marnie wouldn't do that. She was cold, yes, distant, practical to a fault, but malicious. Surely there had to be some misunderstanding. I told myself that Emma, drugged and dying, might have imagined some of it. That memory plays cruel tricks. That grief makes victims out of everyone. But then I found the note, folded inside a separate envelope, unlabeled, with no date. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Marnie. "If you're reading this," it said, "I hope you have found some fragment of the girl we raised you to be." The tone was rawer than any I had seen from Emma before. Accusatory, anguished, yet still pleading, she wrote about the months leading up to her diagnosis, how Marnie had stopped visiting without explanation, how she never returned calls. Emma had thought it was work, ambition, the same things that always pulled her away, until she overheard a phone call between Marnie and a financial advisor. Something about shifting assets, about her parents being too old to make sound decisions. Emma had dismissed it then. She told herself she'd misheard. But as her health declined, more things happened. Withdrawals from their joint account, appointments she hadn't been told about, a change in her insurance coverage that meant she was suddenly no longer eligible for the home care she had chosen. It was all so well documented in Emma's careful writing that it felt less like a letter and more like evidence, like a file she had kept on her own daughter, hoping against hope that she'd never need it. I should have been angry. I should have felt something bright and righteous. Rage, betrayal, the need to confront, to demand answers. But what I felt was nausea. A slow, creeping sickness that curled around my ribs and refused to let go. Because if it was true, if Marnie had used her mother's illness to tighten her grip on our finances, on our choices, on the narrative of our family, then everything I had believed about our daughter was a lie. And worse, maybe I'd let it happen. Maybe, in my quietness, my desire to keep peace, to avoid conflict, I'd allowed Emma to die thinking I had abandoned her. I went upstairs. I opened Marnie's old bedroom closet. The smell of dust and old laundry hit me like a wave. I pulled down a box I hadn't touched in years, one filled with photo albums, school trophies, drawings from when she was 7, a finger painting of a cat, a spelling bee ribbon, a postcard she had sent from camp. I miss you, Daddy. Don't forget to feed Goldie. It felt like someone else's life, someone else's child. The girl in those drawings could not have grown into the woman who manipulated nurses and hid medical information from her father, but the evidence was there. In Emma's hand, in her sorrow, in the slow, unraveling stitch of her letters. I returned to the box. The next letter was dated just 2 weeks before Emma died. I think she wants me gone, it read. Not out of cruelty, out of inconvenience. I've become a burden to her, Harold. And I know what it looks like when someone stops seeing you as a person. She described a conversation with Marnie, one I never knew happened, where our daughter told her, "It's time to stop fighting. You're not yourself anymore. Would Mom really want to go out like this?" Emma had looked at her and said, "I am Mum." But Marnie had already left the room. It was only at that point, as I sat surrounded by paper and the ghost of Emma's voice, that I realized how much I had missed while trying to hold our family together. I had spent so long trying not to make waves that I hadn't noticed the ship was sinking. I had let Marnie control the narrative, assuming she was the responsible one, the strong one, but strength without compassion is just cruelty in a tailored suit. The final letter I read that night wasn't to me, nor to Marnie. It was to a granddaughter who didn't exist. "If one day," Emma wrote, "you find this, if you are the child of the daughter I once raised, I hope you read this and understand that silence is not always peace, that forgetting is not healing, and that your grandmother once tried to fight for the truth, even when no one else wanted to see it." I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. I sat there for a long time until the light outside the kitchen window turned from gray to black. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something in me broke. Not a sharp break. A long, quiet cracking, like the splitting of ice beneath your feet, the kind you don't notice until you're already sinking. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. I sat in the kitchen in the same chair where Emma used to peel apples, my hands folded over the box like a man clutching a confession he didn't yet know how to deliver. Outside, the wind howled low against the windows, and inside, the silence was louder than anything I'd heard in years. I didn't touch the lights. I didn't want brightness. I wanted shadow, ambiguity, a place where nothing had to be resolved yet. But the words I had read wouldn't leave me. They crawled through my thoughts, tugging at everything I'd spent my life believing about fatherhood, marriage, loyalty, and most of all, about Marnie. Every word Emma had written was a thread in a tapestry I had never looked at from the right angle. And now that I had, I couldn't unsee what it revealed, but I still wanted more. Some twisted part of me needed to know just how deep the betrayal went. I didn't want to accuse my daughter based on implication. I needed clarity. I needed proof that what Emma believed wasn't just the product of pain and medication. I needed to know who had failed whom and when the fracture truly began. In the morning, I went up to the attic, a place I hadn't been in at least a decade. Dust lay thick over everything, as if even time itself had forgotten this place existed. I opened the old cedar chest where we used to store our household records, back when people still kept carbon copies and manila folders. I found boxes of utility bills, tax forms, receipts from our first car, letters from the mortgage company when we were struggling in the late 80s. I dug through everything, my fingers blackening with soot and ink, until I found a folder labeled Emma Insurance. I opened it, hoping for nothing more than to confirm dates and policy information. But what I found was stranger. There were 2 sets of documents, one older, listing Emma's preference for home-based palliative care and a list of approved facilities near Belleville, with notes in her handwriting, and mine. The second set was newer, scanned and printed from a computer, listing a completely different insurance provider, one we had never discussed, and a different policy that excluded many of the benefits Emma had originally chosen. The signature at the bottom didn't look right. It was hers, but not. A practiced imitation, too smooth, too perfect, like a child copying their mother's hand. I sat down right there on the attic floor, paper in hand, and felt something inside me collapse. Not with violence, but with the soundless surrender of a man who had been slowly buried under a truth he had tried not to see. There had been changes. Quiet, unnoticed. I remembered now that one of the nurses had mentioned a provider switch, and I had nodded, assuming Emma had handled it without wanting to burden me. But she hadn't. She couldn't have. By then, she was barely coherent. Marnie had handled it. She had signed the papers, chosen the cheapest option, perhaps out of pragmatism, but more likely, I now believed, out of calculation. I took the documents downstairs and laid them out on the kitchen table next to the letters. They formed a grotesque mosaic. Emma's words, the insurance switch, the limits on care, the financial adjustments, all pieces of a pattern I couldn't deny. I made a pot of coffee, not to drink, but to fill the room with the smell of something normal, something human, something that wasn't betrayal. Then I walked into the guest room, formerly the office, and unlocked the old filing cabinet that held our joint banking records. Marnie had once had access to this cabinet. She used to do our online banking when we traveled. I never thought to change the password. I pulled out 3 years' worth of monthly statements. At first, nothing stood out, but in the months leading up to Emma's hospitalization, I noticed a series of automatic transfers, small amounts just under the reporting threshold, moved from our savings to a new account labeled simply MW Consulting. I had never heard of it. I opened the statements one by one, highlighting each transfer. Over 6 months, nearly $32,000 had disappeared. I don't remember sitting down, but I remember the cold of the floor beneath me as I stared at the paper in my hand. Marnie hadn't just cut corners. She had siphoned our savings, cloaked in a name generic enough to avoid suspicion. I didn't know what MW Consulting was. I typed the name into my ancient desktop computer, waited while it took 3 full minutes to boot, and searched the name with our ZIP code. Nothing came up. I added her name. Still nothing. Then I remembered her married name. She had divorced 3 years ago, but she still sometimes used it professionally. I tried again. A single listing. A shell company registered in Delaware, under her name, with no website, no contact information, and no employees. A placeholder. a drain pipe for something she didn't want traced. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the computer, burn the letters, walk outside and disappear into the fog. But I couldn't, because beneath the fury was a deeper emotion, shame. Not hers, mine, for having let it happen, for having trusted, for having been so eager to believe that my daughter was just busy, just overwhelmed, just tired of grief. I had stood beside Emma in her final days, holding her hand and telling her she wasn't alone, while Marnie stood in the hallway signing papers that shortened her mother's life for the sake of a ledger. I wanted to be wrong. God, I wanted so badly to be wrong. But facts do not bend to desire. They only stand still like gravestones. In the middle of this spiral, I remembered something odd. A moment I had buried because it had seemed so minor. The day after Emma's funeral, I'd gone to the bank to deposit a few checks, mostly sympathy offerings from church friends. The teller had looked at me strangely and said, "Mr. Wilkerson, your account has been flagged for unusual activity. Do you want to speak with a manager?" I'd laughed it off. What unusual activity could there be? I was an old man who bought groceries and gas. I'd told them no, thanked them, and left. But now, the memory burned like a flare. I had ignored a warning because I didn't want to feel paranoid. Because I still believed my family, whatever its dysfunctions, had been held together by love. Or at the very least, decency. That night, I sat in the living room with all the documents spread across the floor. I tried to make sense of them, to create a timeline, to understand the psychology behind it. Had Marnie always been this cold, this strategic? Or had something changed her? Was it ambition, greed, resentment? Did she hate Emma for being ill? Did she blame me for being weak? I searched my memory for a single moment of confrontation, a single argument where she had aired her grievances, and I came up blank. Marnie didn't fight. She maneuvered. She smiled. She redirected. And in that calm voice of hers, the one she used in courtrooms and conference calls, she rewrote our lives without ever raising her tone. I tried calling her, just once. The phone rang twice and went to voicemail. Her message was the same. "This is Marnie. Please leave a message." I didn't. What could I say? That her mother had written a dossier of emotional crimes, that I had uncovered a scheme, that I no longer recognized the woman I'd raised? No, I couldn't say any of that yet. Not until I knew what I wanted from her. Not until I understood what justice looked like for a dying woman who never asked for revenge. Only truth. By the time the sun rose, I was no closer to peace. But I was closer to understanding. And understanding, however bitter, is the beginning of choice. I gathered the letters, placed them back in the box, and carried it upstairs to the bedroom. I set it on the dresser, next to Emma's favorite brooch and her wedding photograph. For the first time in years, I opened the curtains. Light came in, pale and unassuming, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood there, eyes burning from fatigue, hands trembling with the weight of so many silent years, and whispered into the empty room, "I see it now, Emma. I see everything." I didn't plan to visit her. I had no strategy, no list of questions, no speech prepared to unleash years of buried confusion and fresh betrayal. I simply woke up that morning with a certainty I couldn't ignore, the kind of knowing that settles in your gut before your brain has caught up. The air in the house felt wrong, too still, as if it too had paused in anticipation. I dressed without thinking. Same sweater, same coat I always wore when it got cold enough to see your breath. I drove the hour and a half to Chicago in near silence, the radio off, the windows slightly fogged despite the defroster humming dutifully. My hands clenched the steering wheel harder than necessary, knuckles pale and stiff. The streets were wet from an early rain, slick and glinting with traffic lights that made everything look artificial. I parked 2 blocks from her building, not because there wasn't space closer, but because I needed those extra steps to convince myself that I hadn't lost my mind. The sidewalk was lined with boutiques and coffee shops, the kind of place where people went about their lives, never imagining that upstairs, behind frosted windows, someone's father had arrived with a box full of ghosts and a truth too sharp to touch directly. Her building was newer than I remembered, clean and minimalist, the kind of place where smiles are rehearsed and doormen never ask questions. She lived on the 6th floor. I buzzed, unsure of what I'd say when her voice came through, but it never did. The door clicked open almost instantly, as if she were watching and waiting. That alone put a pit in my stomach. She opened her apartment door before I even knocked. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or apprehension. She was barefoot, in yoga pants and a loose sweater, a half-drunk cup of tea in her hand. The scent of ginger and lemon filled the hallway. "Dad," she said, not warmly, not coldly, just a neutral acknowledgement that I still existed. I stepped inside. The place was spotless, designed in shades of grey and white, with no sign of personal history. No photos, no clutter, no past. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom for a life someone wanted others to believe they were living. She didn't ask why I had come. She just gestured to the couch and sat in a chair across from me, legs crossed neatly, her expression practiced and still. I placed the box on the table between us. Her eyes darted to it, then back to mine, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not fear, but exhaustion. The kind of fatigue that only appears in people who've spent too long maintaining a version of themselves they can no longer carry. I opened the box without a word and removed a single letter, the one addressed to her, and slid it across the table. She stared at it for a long time. Her hands didn't move, her breath shallow and steady. Then, slowly, she picked it up, unfolded it, and read. I watched her eyes move across the page. I watched the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled around the edge of the paper, the slight tremble that betrayed how much she had tried to prepare for this. When she finished, she folded it neatly, set it aside, and said nothing. The silence between us was thick and pulsating. Finally, I said, "She knew." Long before I did. Marnie looked at me. Not startled, not angry, just tired. "I know she did," she replied, "and I knew you'd find out eventually." Her voice was low, stripped of all pretense. I wanted to scream, to ask her why, to demand to know what kind of person could do that to their own mother, but I didn't. Because the look in her eyes was not defensive. It was resigned. She took a deep breath. "You think I did it for money," she said. "That I manipulated her care, stole from you, lied because I wanted more." I nodded, because that's exactly what I believed. She shook her head. "I did it because she asked me to." That stopped me cold. "What?" I asked. She looked away. "The new policy, the hospice arrangements, the transfers. They weren't for me. They were for you. She didn't want to leave you drowning in debt. She knew what treatment would cost. She knew it wouldn't save her. She wanted to go quickly, with dignity, and she knew you wouldn't let her. You still believed she'd get better." I sat back, stunned, heart thudding in my chest. "And the money?" I asked. "MW Consulting?" Her lips tightened. "That's mine. I used it to manage the funds discreetly, to shield you from seeing what was happening. She didn't want you involved in the logistics. She didn't want you to feel like you were watching her die by spreadsheet." I tried to process that. It didn't make sense. Emma had always been open with me, transparent to a fault. Would she really have made such decisions behind my back? And more importantly, would she have trusted Marnie with them? I opened another envelope and read it aloud. Emma's words, the ones about betrayal, about being a burden, about not feeling like a person. When I finished, Marnie looked stricken. "She wrote that," she whispered. "To you?" I nodded. Her hands were shaking now. I didn't know. She never said any of that to me. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. Doubt. The kind that creeps in when the story you've told yourself for years suddenly doesn't hold up to the truth you didn't ask to hear. "I thought I was helping," she said. "I thought I was protecting both of you from what was coming." I stood. I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't know what was true and what was a story built to justify the unbearable. As I walked to the door, she said softly, "Dad, she made me promise not to let you carry the end of her. She said you'd try to save her, and it would destroy you." I turned. "And instead, you destroyed us both," I said. She didn't answer. She just nodded, tears finally breaking past the dam she'd built over years of silence. I left the apartment. The city looked different now. Smaller, colder. I didn't know if what she said was true. I didn't know if Emma had confided in her in ways she never had with me, or if Marnie was rewriting the past to make sense of her choices. But what I knew was this. The version of my daughter I'd clung to no longer existed. Maybe she never had. Maybe we were all actors in a tragedy no one had the courage to call by name. And as I drove home, the rain began again, soft and steady, washing the windshield in waves that blurred everything, lights, signs, faces. I didn't turn on the wipers. I let it all stay blurred. I didn't want clarity. Not yet. I needed the pain to settle first, to find its place in the architecture of who I now was. Because after that day, I would never be the same. And neither would she. And neither, for that matter, would Emma, who, even in death, had more control over us than we ever understood. By the time I returned home, it was already dark, and the kitchen lights, which I had forgotten to turn off, cast long shadows across the cluttered table where the box and all of Emma's letters still waited, silent sentinels to the most unraveling week of my life. I didn't touch them. I didn't remove my coat. I just stood in the doorway, staring at the proof of everything I thought I knew, feeling both overwhelmed and hollowed out, like someone who had stumbled through fire only to realize the burns were beneath the skin. I kept replaying Marnie's face in my mind, her expressionless calm when I arrived, the tiredness behind her voice, the tears that finally came not with denial, but with a kind of collapsing grief I hadn't expected. If what she told me was true, then I was wrong about more than just her. I was wrong about Emma, about myself, about what we thought we were doing for one another. But if it wasn't true, if it was just another manipulation, then the betrayal ran deeper than I could fathom. And the cruelest part was that I no longer trusted myself to know the difference. Sleep didn't come. I walked the house like a ghost, stopping in each room to listen, not for sounds, but for the sense of a presence, some lingering trace of Emma's voice in the walls. I found myself whispering to her in the dark, asking her what was real, what I had missed, what I was meant to do with the ruins she left behind. But the house gave me no answers. It only echoed back my own questions. The next morning, I called the lawyer who handled Emma's will. A man named Lowell, in his late 70s himself, half retired but still sharp enough to remember details most people forget. I asked him about the estate. I asked if there had been any alterations to the will, any undisclosed instructions. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Your daughter came to me shortly before Emma passed. She asked about revising the will in your wife's name. I refused. Emma hadn't contacted me directly, and I didn't feel comfortable proceeding. I felt a wave of nausea. "Did you tell Emma that Marnie had asked?" I asked. Another pause. Number I couldn't. She was already in hospice by then. "I assumed you knew." I thanked him, hung up, and sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. Another piece, another shadow in the picture that refused to clarify. I pulled out the folder where I kept the original copy of the will. I reread it, line by line, looking for signs of tampering, but it was exactly as Emma had dictated a year before her diagnosis. Everything to be divided equally between Marnie and me, with specific items: her mother's brooch, her wedding ring, her journals, designated to stay in the family. But some of those items were missing. The brooch was there, the ring wasn't. The journals, which she kept for decades in a cedar box under our bed, were gone. I tore through the house looking for them. Nothing. I called Marnie. She didn't answer. I texted. No reply. The silence was louder than any confrontation. I went back to the letters. One I hadn't yet read had a post-it attached with just one word: truth. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably Emma's. I unfolded it carefully. It began simply: "Harold, if you're reading this, I hope you've forgiven me. Or at least, I hope you understand." She went on to describe the months after her diagnosis, how the doctors had been more honest with Marnie than with her, how information was filtered through layers of concern and misdirection. "I didn't want to know," she wrote. I wanted to believe I had time, but they took even that from me. Your silence, Marnie's decisions, the slow erasure of my agency until I became something managed instead of someone loved. She wrote of conversations I couldn't remember, moments I thought were inconsequential, that in her retelling became pivotal. "The day you brought me tea in the hospital," she wrote, "and you said, 'Just rest, Em. Don't think too much.' I knew then that you weren't going to fight for the truth. You were going to keep me comfortable, even if it meant lying. I don't blame you. But I couldn't forgive it either. I wanted to protest. I wanted to say she was wrong, but the more I read, the more I realized how many times I'd chosen silence over clarity. I had thought I was protecting her. I had thought I was being strong, but Emma saw that strength as a kind of absence. She had wanted to be seen, even in her dying, and instead, we had all looked away. And now, with each new revelation, I saw her not as the wife I had cared for, but as the woman who had been quietly erased by the very people who claimed to love her most. That evening I got a call from a woman named Karen, Emma's old friend from her book club. We hadn't spoken in years. Her voice was hesitant. She said, "I wasn't sure whether to call. I thought maybe it wasn't my place, but I found something, and I think you should see it." She lived just 20 minutes away. I drove in silence, heart racing, the box on the passenger seat like a living thing. Her house was small, cozy, cluttered in the way only lived-in spaces are. She led me to a drawer in her hallway cabinet and pulled out a notebook. "Emma gave this to me," she said. "She asked me to hold on to it. Said you might come looking one day." I opened it slowly. It was one of her journals, the missing ones. The entries were raw, unfiltered. Pages filled with reflections, observations, pain and confusion. She had written about Marnie in tones that alternated between pride and sorrow. "She's become so capable," one entry said, "but I don't know if she remembers how to be kind." Another read, "Today she told me not to cry. That crying made it harder for her to help me." I apologized for crying. There was one entry dated 3 days before Emma died. It read, "I heard them arguing outside my room. Marnie said I was just prolonging the inevitable. Harold didn't respond. He just walked away. I felt something crack inside me. Not because of what she said, but because he didn't defend me. Not even then. I sat down, the weight of the book in my hands unbearable. I remembered that day. I remembered being overwhelmed, exhausted, confused by the medications and the schedules and the nurses who seemed to change every few hours. I remembered hearing raised voices and retreating, telling myself I didn't want to make things worse. And now, all these years later, I understood that what I thought was restraint had been abandonment. I thanked Karen, took the journal, and drove home. That night I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into Emma's old sewing room and opened the drawer where she kept her stationery. I pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not a letter, but a reckoning. I wrote to Marnie. I told her everything I had found, everything I now understood. I didn't accuse her. I didn't scream. I simply laid out the truth, piece by piece, and asked her one question. When did we stop being a family? I mailed it the next morning. 3 days later, I received a package. No return address. Inside was Emma's wedding ring and a flash drive. I plugged it into the computer. There was a single folder. Inside, documents, spreadsheets, voice memos. Marnie narrating decisions, explanations, apologies never sent. One file was labeled, Dad, if you find this. I clicked. Her voice came through, soft, unsure. I don't know if you'll ever listen to this. I don't know if you'll understand, but I did what I thought was right. I thought Mom would want it that way. And maybe I was wrong. Maybe I took too much control. Maybe I stopped seeing her as a mother and started seeing her as a project. But I didn't hate her. I didn't want her gone. I was just scared and tired, and I didn't want to lose both of you. So I tried to hold it all together, and I broke everything. I listened to that voice again and again, not because it gave me peace, but because it finally gave me something real. Not an excuse, not a justification, but a human moment. The sound of someone too proud to ask for help and too scared to admit they needed forgiveness. I still didn't know what to believe. I didn't know if Emma would have accepted the apology, but I knew this. We had all failed each other in different ways, and no amount of truth would ever restore what we had lost. But maybe, just maybe, it could stop the bleeding. I didn't plan the visit. It happened the same way all irreversible things do. Quietly, almost casually, with no dramatic wind or thunderclap to mark its significance. I woke up, made coffee, stared at the envelope on the kitchen table addressed to Marnie that I had rewritten 3 times and never mailed. I folded it again, tucked it into my coat pocket, and walked out the door before I could change my mind. The morning was gray, the sky a flat sheet of dull steel, and the air had that end-of-season weight that made everything feel heavier than it was. I drove without music, hands tight on the wheel, jaw clenched against a tide of emotions I didn't fully understand. The city rose around me in slow, indifferent shapes, and when I parked outside her building, I realized it was the first time I'd come without resentment or accusation burning in my chest. I didn't know what I wanted from her anymore. An apology, an explanation, some grand emotional breakthrough that would redeem what had already been broken beyond repair. No, I think all I wanted now was clarity, not of facts, but of feeling, of what remained between a father and daughter after everything else had been stripped away. She answered the door looking surprised, her hair damp, a towel still wrapped around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she looked vulnerable. Not fragile, but open in a way that disarmed me. She didn't ask why I was there. She stepped aside silently, letting me in, as if she had known this moment was coming and had no intention of trying to control it. I stood in the center of the living room and took in the space that was both hers and not hers, the curated sterility of a life built around efficiency and avoidance. I handed her the envelope. She took it, but didn't open it. Instead, she walked to the kitchen and made tea, the ritual familiar and oddly comforting. When she returned, we sat facing each other in the kind of silence that only exists between people bound by blood and tragedy. Finally, I spoke. "I've read everything," I said. "Emma's letters, the journal, the documents. I've listened to your voice recording. I've seen what you tried to shield me from and what you tried to manage behind my back." She nodded slowly, no surprise in her expression, just a kind of weary acceptance. "I know you think I betrayed her," she said, "and maybe I did. Maybe in trying to protect her, I erased her. Maybe I thought that being strong meant being cold." Her voice cracked just slightly and she looked down, fingers curled tightly around her mug. I wanted to reach across and touch her hand, but I didn't. Not yet. "She needed us to see her," I said. "Not just as a patient or a problem or a future absence, but as a woman who was still alive, still feeling, still afraid." Marnie flinched, and I saw the words land. "She didn't tell me those things," she whispered. "Not the way she told you in those letters. She never said she felt erased. I thought I was helping. I thought she wanted to go quickly. She said she didn't want to be a burden." I shook my head. "She didn't want to be forgotten." "There's a difference." Silence again, but this time it felt less like a barrier and more like a space clearing for something to rise. Marnie looked up, eyes red. "I don't think I know how to mourn her properly," she said. "I've tried, but I keep cycling through guilt and defense and this tight, breathless fear that if I stop managing everything, I'll fall apart." Her voice was raw now, stripped of the polish she usually wore like armor. "You already fell apart," I said gently. "You just did it in private, where no one could see you make mistakes." She opened the envelope slowly, unfolded the letter, and read in silence. I watched her eyes move across the page, her mouth tighten, her shoulders slump. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "I don't know how to fix this." And I told her the truth. "You can't," I said. "Some things don't get fixed. Some things you just carry. But you can choose how you carry them." We sat for a long time after that. No dramatic revelations, no absolution, just a fragile new honesty suspended between us like a bridge made of breath and memory. And in that moment, I saw not the woman who had made so many cold decisions, not the daughter who had hurt me and betrayed Emma, but the scared, overwhelmed girl who had once asked me if thunder could make a house fall down. I told her about the box, about how it had sat untouched for 6 years, like a buried truth I wasn't brave enough to face. She asked to see it. That afternoon, we drove back to Belleville in silence. She sat beside me, not as the daughter I'd lost, but as the stranger I might learn to know again. The house felt different with her in it. Not better, just less empty. We sat at the kitchen table side by side, and I opened the box one last time. She read the letters aloud, her voice trembling, sometimes stopping, sometimes crying, and I let her fall apart where I could see it. Because sometimes that's the only forgiveness we get, the chance to witness each other's breaking and still stay. That night she slept in her old room, and I, for the first time in years, slept without the heaviness of unsaid things pressing against my ribs. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't resolution. But it was something. A breath, a pause, a step forward in a house full of ghosts. The seasons changed slowly after that. First the brittle hush of late autumn, then the long silence of winter, and finally the reluctant thaw of early spring. And in that time, Marnie began to return, not in grand gestures or with declarations of atonement, but in the small, unspoken ways that carry the weight of real intention. She came on Sundays at first, with groceries she didn't need to bring, and asked about leaking faucets and loose shingles as if the answers mattered more than the past. Sometimes we spoke, other times we didn't. But the house, long, stagnant, and thick with memory, began to breathe again, ever so slightly, as if unsure whether it could still accommodate the living. I watched her move through its rooms like someone visiting a childhood dream half-remembered, touching old photographs, straightening bookshelves, pausing at Emma's sewing chair without sitting down. There were moments when I thought of asking her why she hadn't come sooner, why she had let the years calcify between us, but I never did. Some questions, once asked, flatten what little peace remains, and I was no longer looking for confessions. I was looking for quiet, sustainable truths that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be believed. One day, without ceremony, she brought back the journals, the ones she had taken, the ones I thought had vanished into some locked drawer in a city apartment. She placed them on the kitchen table, neatly stacked, bound with a ribbon I recognized as one Emma used to tie around Christmas cookies. She said nothing. I said nothing. But in that silence was the loudest apology I had ever heard. I didn't ask why she had taken them, what she had hoped to learn or control or protect. I didn't ask because I already knew. Some part of her had needed to possess the pieces of Emma that she hadn't understood in life. Some part of her had needed to see if the pages would offer the love she'd always doubted, the approval she hadn't been able to receive in the way she'd needed it. And maybe, in reading them, she had found not absolution, but empathy, the kind that only comes too late. I didn't read the journals again. I'd already heard Emma's voice in the ways that mattered. But I kept them, not as evidence, but as testimony, proof that a life was lived and recorded, that pain was documented not to accuse, but to make meaning. I placed them back in the cedar box, wrapped them gently, and returned them to the closet where they had once belonged. That evening, Marnie cooked dinner. It wasn't good, overcooked vegetables, a dry roast, but I ate every bite. We sat together afterward, washing dishes by hand, passing plates without comment, as if we had always done this. And maybe, in another life, we had. The day I finally cleaned out Emma's closet, Marnie helped. We didn't talk much. I handed her dresses and scarves, and she folded them carefully, placing some in boxes for donation and some in a separate bin marked Keep. When we came across Emma's wedding shoes, scuffed and faded but still wrapped in tissue, we both paused. I held them for a long moment, then placed them back in the box and closed the lid. Marnie didn't ask why. She understood. Some things are not meant to be thrown away, not because they serve a function, but because they held someone's joy once, and joy deserves its own kind of grave. Months passed. The house changed. Marnie hired someone to repaint the porch. I let her. She replaced the broken gate without asking. I let that happen too. I began to think of the house not as a mausoleum but as a vessel, still heavy with memory, but capable of carrying something new. One morning, I found a letter on the table. It was addressed to me in Marnie's handwriting. I opened it slowly, expecting another explanation, another accounting, but it was short, only a few lines. She wrote, "I don't expect to be forgiven. But I hope one day you'll see me not only as the woman who made terrible choices, but also as the girl who never stopped wanting to be seen by her parents. I'm trying, Dad. I don't know what else to say." I folded the letter, placed it in the same drawer where I had once kept her Christmas cards, and left it there, not as closure, but as continuity. On the anniversary of Emma's death, Marnie and I planted tulips in the backyard, where the soil was soft and the light reached even in the late afternoon. Emma had always wanted tulips. We never got around to it. We planted them now, not as penance, but as promise. Not to the past, but to the future, where memory would be something that grew, not something that lingered only in shadows. And as we knelt together in the dirt, hands filthy, knees aching, backs sore. I realized that this was what forgiveness looked like. Not a grand reconciliation, not a dramatic redemption, but two people, wounded and weary, choosing to stay anyway, choosing to build something tender in the soil of everything they had lost.